Well, welcome to our Level 2 prayer training videos. Today we are talking about sexual wholeness. And so my name is Steph Heatbrink. I'm the prayer team leader here at Third Church. And joining me today are Mike Cranmer, who is a therapist here in Pella and a member of our Third Church family, along with his wife, Allie, who is the head of our student ministries here at Third. And they both have to talk about sex a lot, right, for their job. So we invited them in to be a part of our interview time today. And I have to tell you, so before I was the prayer team leader, I oversaw our junior high ministry, and we would talk about sex every year. And so every time before we'd get started, I would have the kids yell out the word sex as loud as they could so that they knew we can talk about sex in church, people.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because actually it's a subject that does not get talked about near enough and causes a lot of pain, a lot of brokenness. A lot of people are under shame because of that. And so I'm grateful for us to be able to have kind of an honest conversation about sexuality, about praying for wholeness in this area, because it's a massive need for our culture and for our church family, honestly, in this time. So I'm going to start off with a few questions in a minute, but I just wanted to say we really want this conversation always to be just undergirded with so much grace, because one of the main reasons we don't talk about sex and sex in church is because people are just cloaked with shame, and they've been shamed by the church at times, and they've been shamed by other situations, and so we want to undergird this conversation with grace. In the resources that are attached to this video below, there's a great writing about Gomer and Hosea, and it starts off with this quote, and it says this, that Judd Wilhite says that the story of Hosea and Gomer is the second most powerful picture of God's love in the Bible. Other than Christ's death, there is no greater picture of love. And of course, if you know the story of Gomer and Hosea, you know, Hosea is asked to go basically marry a prostitute, and she continues to be unfaithful, and he's continued to call to just pursue her, and pursue her. And it's such an incredible picture of what God's heart for us is. And even if we're unfaithful, even if we have places of failure, he is constantly pursuing us, even as believers, right, when we're in this place. And so that's kind of how we want to undergird this conversation. So let's see. Let's talk a little bit about how do you feel, or give me a few comments about what you think about that message of Gomer and Hosea. Why is that an important message for the church, and why do we kind of need that to help us in this conversation?
I think I love that story because our church view would look at that story and just, I think, easily judge Gomer and say, you are so tarnished. Yes. There is no way that this wholesome man should come after you. Yeah. And I just love that Hosea will do anything. I mean, the Lord tells him, and so he sticks by what the Lord has said and pursues her hard. And I just love that. I love how the Lord is so welcoming and his arms are open, and we get to see that and just in a different story than Jesus on the cross.
Yeah,
so
it's so good.
Yeah, and I think there's a real big call to that for us to understand as Christians who enter into marriage, the marriage is worth fighting for.
Yes.
I think the weariness of that is at times when we go before the Lord in that process, we don't give ourselves permission to leave if it becomes abusive.
Yes.
And so I think there needs to be a sacred balance between the two.
Yep. Yeah, which takes some discernment and counseling and prayer and other people to walk with you on that journey. But I love what you said, Mike, that marriage is worth fighting for, and that we have a God who pursues
That's
us.
right.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's just start off. We, of course, need to kind of situate this conversation in the midst of our culture. And so let's talk a little bit about what are some of the things that we're seeing in culture right now that are contributing, to high levels, really, of sexual brokenness. So we are seeing this in ministry all the time right now. We are thankfully, I'm delighted that we're praying with lots of people, but it's also hard that there's so many stories related to sexual brokenness. So let's just talk a little bit about culture. How is that influencing what's happening across the larger church too?
I think a real big piece is kind of the social media aspect of it. One of the things that I think a lot of youth will see is like the hashtag like cat porn or shoe porn or food porn. So there's this a heightened normalization of pornography in culture and in society right now.
And a hypersexualization.
Right?
That we would call food porn or turtles.
Right.
So, which is just something that's gotten out of its proper place.
Correct.
So, how about you, Allie?
Yeah, I think, when I think of just culture today, I actually think of how often we're force-fed just sexuality. And so whether it's being like love equals sex, or it's same sex, or it's multiple partners having affairs, whatever it is, there's not one show, one song in media today that doesn't portray that in some way. And so every genre of music talks about it. Every TV show that we see, even our favorite TV shows are showing this as, even just by showing it, I think it has allowed our brains and the enemy to come in and say, see, that's normal. And and it's not. And so, I would say all culture is now normalizing sex and sexuality. Yeah, and one of the things we talked about too is we were preparing for that too. It normalizes it, but it also gives a really narcissistic picture of sexuality. So it's what you want, what you need. One of the other things, of course, with culture too, is just that there's this misconstrued idea that happens with intimacy and sex, and it's really this illusion of intimacy. We see that with pornography, with just hooking up with people. There's really it's portrayed as like, oh, this is an intimate thing with somebody, but it's really an illusion of that. Mike, do you want to speak just a little bit to that?
Yes. So I think oftentimes within sexual relationships, we think of sexual intimacy as the way we express intimacy. We forget about the relational side of that. So building relationships, knowing what it's like to set healthy boundaries, keep healthy boundaries, knowing what is it okay to experience a safe hug from somebody else type of thing. So we're setting up the relational side of things. So maybe for later on we can also experience the sexual side of things within the covenant of marriage, because we know how to relate to each other as people, honoring people first. So
and it's an interesting point too. We're designed as humans for non-sexualized intimacy. But it's like you don't even see a picture of that anymore, of just that safe. What we've talked in some other videos, just that safe non-sexual touch or talk and communication. Which is just kind of grieving that we've lost the ability as a culture to know how to do that well, because that's actually we're designed to have that need as humans, and everything has become so sex saturated that that doesn't feel very safe anymore. And we just a quick story. We were talking about how. I grew up as a volleyball player and played collegiate sports, and we'd talk about how we would play with each other's hair, and there was a lot of just non-sexual touch that I feel like we probably couldn't do anymore. In our minds, there was nothing sexual there, but it feels like culture has skewed things so far that there's just not safe places for that anymore. And then, we'll hit on this later then, when you're have touch like that and maybe have questions that culture has given you about homosexuality and things like that, then that's hard to wrestle through as well. But this is another thing too that we talked about. We've lost being able to declare like sin as sin. And then also that we talked about, if you have any normal wonderings or thoughts, that there really is a difference, though, between temptation and actually acting out on our sin. Do you want to talk just a little bit about those pieces?
Yeah, I think because of how we have normalized sex so much, I think we now don't even view the act of sex or anything sexual as sinful. So I was talking to a leader last year, and he said, when I was in high school, girls always wore turtlenecks, and if you wore even like a cowl neck shirt, that was a lot of skin.
Yeah.
So now to have girls who wear super short shorts and show skin, can show their midriff, that is all, we've all been desensitized to it. And so I think that culture has reframed it so much that even as Christ followers, we make exceptions. So in God's perfect plan, he made this beautiful book that just shares his perfect plan, that we can live in the freedom of that plan. Mm-hmm. And then when we start tweaking it and going our own way, then we start experiencing the consequences of not living in the perfection that God desired and designed for us. And so in that, I think when we aren't understanding what sin is and we're just allowing ourselves to do things, there's just, like I said before, there's just natural consequences that then we don't understand. Well, why is that happening? Because now it's permissible. And so our own selves can't understand and wrestle in this tension of, but culture said it was okay, and but God didn't, and who's right? Mm-hmm. And more often than not, we all get to see that culture is easy to listen to because it's the thing that's being force-fed the most onto us. And so, that's what I would say about that one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right, Allie. And and until we're able to name something for what it is, too, we can't actually step into a healing process. Right. So if we have become, if a emotional attachment to a coworker has gone beyond the bounds of just friendship and a healthy thing, like we actually have to name it, for what it is before we can actually pursue healing and wholeness in that place. And so,
I think I have a pastor friend in Florida, and we were talking one time, and he said something really powerful, that we can't overcome something that we are in agreement with.
Yes, I think that's very true, Mike. Yep.
To build off of being able to name it, if it's something that we decide is part of this is okay, we will still struggle in that area because we're not separating ourselves from it.
Because we begin to empower what we agree with.
Correct.
Absolutely. Great. All right. What are some of the issues that are underlying some of the sexual brokenness things and sexual addiction that we're seeing more prevalent now?
Yeah, I think, we talked about just intimacy, that being kind of misrepresented, misconstrued.
Yes.
I think a lack of affirmation with our identity. And so saying that just meaning whether we didn't have parent figures that were affirming our masculinity, our femininity, true feminine, true masculine in each person, then we'll go seek that out and desire that deeply. And so I think one of the other issues with sexual brokenness is just affirming identity. And so I think we have so much swung to allow other people, other things to define our identity that when we don't have complete affirmation, whether it's from our parents or ultimately from the Lord, then we just seek it. And so we desire to find our identity in something and somewhere. And so like for me as a female growing up, it was easier for me to desire to be in a relationship with a guy so that he could speak those things over me, even though I had great parents speaking those things. But culture had told me that was actually more normal than my parents speaking that. And so for me, I would rather go to a guy and have them speak whatever they're going to speak, and I would start listening to that and hearing that. So I think a lack of affirmation of identity is a huge one too.
Yeah, and I think just and we've said this multiple times, just the level of exposure. So, when kids are exposed to sexual images at such a young age, and then just the access, easy access to things, and even the lack of conversation around that. So you obviously deal with students. I worked with students for years. I mean, I don't think we can reiterate enough that parents and kids need to be having just open conversations. It's not the talk. You need to be having an open door conversation with your children a lot about sex and sexuality and if something comes on a show that you're like, this is inappropriate, call it out and talk about what's happening in that moment and help them to begin to critically process, see what they're doing here in this situation so that they can actually become identifiers of those things. And we're living in a culture really that has it just has lost boundaries.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, kind of from a psychological standpoint, it's like we don't really have boundaries to our sexuality anymore. And it's so interesting because we know in so many areas of our life that without boundaries, we end up a mess.
Yes.
But we keep kind of swallowing the pill around this that we can do whatever we want, and that's freedom.
Yes.
Versus, like, we know if we eat unhealthy, if we don't take care of our bodies in other ways, that it's unhealthy. But we can't quite get there.
Yeah, and we're a culture of instant gratification.
Yes.
And so the internet is at our fingertips or on our tablet 24/7.
Yep.
And so we have instant access. And sometimes our children have instant access to that as well.
Yeah. Another thing that people may disagree with this, but I think we're all kind of on the same page. Why is sexual sin actually different though than other sins? And again, this is not a shaming thing, but just because of maybe life repercussions. But do you guys want to speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, so ultimately in God's eyes all sin is the same. However, there's this piece of sexual sin that I don't think, at least for me, wasn't explained really well. That there's this piece that happens where there's a soul tie that can happen in the midst of it. So the consequence of that is different. So if you steal, the consequence of that is different than telling a lie, or having sex or doing sexual things with someone is different than telling a lie, And so, we were telling Steph yesterday that this is part of our story, that for me, I was told growing up in church that as long as you don't have sex, you're going to be okay.
Yes.
If you don't have sex, you'll be fine. Well, in a teenage girl's mind who's very much force-fed by all the different shows that were on, Dawson's Creek, 90210, all those different things, that made other things permissible in the midst of that. And but no one explained how that would affect our marriage someday. And so I could look at Mike and say, I never actually had sex, but no one said to me, hey, it's going to be hard because you made these agreements with people simply by having sexual acts that aren't talked about. And so
that there's a soul tie is the word that we've used that can be created. It can be created through being overly emotionally intimate with another person, physically intimate with another person, and and if those things aren't dealt with, you can carry sort of the consequences of those things. Our sin can be forgiven, but that there's still consequences for our actions. And so that's the part that I think people need to understand. Are you forgiven by Jesus? Yep, but are there consequences for the things that we've done? Sometimes those consequences are allowed to play out, and there's another level of intentionality that we have to go through, and especially related to sexual things. So I can be forgiven from pornography, but I still have to go through a healing process of maybe restoring things with my wife and cleansing my imagination. And
That's right.
It's really, we talked about how sometimes the forgiveness is actually just the start of the journey. So
I would say for Mike and I, the Hosea and Gomer story actually really related well, because although I was told not to have sex, so I really made sure I didn't have the actual act of sex, and that really did leave everything else permissible. And and so I remember my girlfriends and I in high school even having competitions with how far we could get, just because we didn't have any realm of this was healthy boundaries, and no one was really telling us that. And so when Mike and I got together, Hosea and Gomer made sense, because I had dreamt of being with a man who had never done anything sexually or would even push me into that, but I never thought I was good enough. And so for me, I always would turn my eyes to another guy, because like in Mike's wholeness, he was too good for me. And so, I think, So for me, I knew I was forgiven, but there were just pieces in our marriage bed that we really needed to fight for with one another.
Yep.
And that part was a little bit explained to us in our premarital, but there were literal times where we would have to kind of stop everything and just pray over what was happening, because either I was associating it with something bad, or there were these looming things that were that spiritually were happening that I didn't know of or make sense of. And so the Lord really had to take me through somewhat of a deliverance piece, and not somewhat, but a deliverance piece where he just invited me into completely confessing all of it and everyone, and then laying it before him. And from that point on, I was because of that, we were freed of it. And it provided such a different unity between us, and we could feel the significance and the freedom, but that was never explained before,
Right.
And so I naively was just like, well, as long as I don't do this, I'm going to be okay. So
because we aren't taught God's heart behind the boundaries, right?
We're often just told no.
That he just longs for our best, and his plans are so good, and that you'll be so grateful and thankful. And you're right, it gets back to kind of our instant gratification culture. We're not good at waiting for things very well anymore, and so there's a lot of things that can play into that, but but your story's beautiful too, because you experienced healing as well. So you experienced some of the significance of that pain, but also, God's healing goodness in the midst of that. And so when we use the word soul ties, one of the things that we're talking about is that kind of in the spiritual realm, it's like your spirit has made an attachment with another person's spirit. And so it actually takes an intentional closing of a door to that, kind of cutting that off in the name of Jesus. And so so that is something we will often do in prayer. So if someone has had, we may ask the Lord, would you lift names of people that you might have soul ties to? And then we're going to go through and we're going to pray in the name of Jesus that those doors are closed. There might need to be confession around things that happened. And again, none of this is for shaming purposes. We're bringing it into the light so it loses power, and so that we can close any door that we've given to the enemy by not staying in the boundaries that the Lord gave us. So, all right. Let's talk a little bit about healthy sexuality. Where has a church got it right? Where have we misconstrued things and made this a harder conversation? So just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think as a church body, but also as just believers, I think defining what sex is very important. And so if your scope of sex is very limited to only genital sex, then anything else is permissible. And so sometimes the shame comes in when it's you may not have sex. So we're told sex is bad from the get-go. So then when we become married, all the messages that we've had are sex is bad. Sex is bad. So as a church, we need to continue to reframe that sex is great for marriage.
And that it's a good gift from the Lord, but it comes with healthy boundaries.
And then also having just that conversation of what does the world of sex look like? And so
I think also we have, I think the church has done a beautiful job, and I think the heart of the church is to make, or my hope is the heart of the church, Big C, all over the world, is to really help people know God's heart for things. And so God's heart is so great. He wants us to have fun with sex. He wants us to enjoy it. He blessed that union. But I think that sometimes, I've been in situations where as a female, I have literally been told that you will not enjoy sex, you know? And
what a terrible message to share,
or that men are more sexual than females, or that as a wife, you need to be able to allow your husband to have sex with you just so he can feel
more intimate. And and so
I think those things, as as a female alone are really hard to understand.
Yep.
And so if you are the opposite of that, like you do enjoy sex or you are sexual, then you're like, well, what's wrong with me?
Yes.
And
Yep.
when the Lord has actually created that really for both of us to enjoy that intimate moment together.
Yeah.
And so, just walking with different females and couples for us, I think we've really seen how the church, I would say my hope is unintentionally has actually created more roadblocks than excitement.
Yeah.
And so that just grieves me because
Yep.
that isn't what God wanted at all for that.
Yeah.
And for that union.
Yep. I think you're right. I love, there's a book called Mystery of Marriage, and I love how he talks about sex because he says, in marriage, you're naked with one another, and there's no shame, and it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's the opposite of the garden, or it's a restoration back to the Garden of Eden.
That's beautiful.
And he was like, the enemy hates that when it happens under God's goodness and his plan because, it was with sin came shame.
Right.
But in the context of how God created it to be, you can have that experience again without the shame.
Yeah.
And that's so beautiful.
It is so beautiful.
And so just a couple of quick resources kind of related to this, because we're trying to walk with people in healing places of sexual brokenness, but also, encouraging healthy sexuality in marriages. So under our prayer events page, we did a healing event on healing our broken sexuality. There's an excellent teaching, but then there's some really great resources, books that cover a wide variety of topics. This is such a massive topic, so I mean, we're just hitting the surface level of a lot of things today, but from pornography to healthy sexuality in marriage to abuse to addiction. There's some really great resources available on that page as well as along with some of the teaching handouts that you'll receive with this video. So just wanted to make sure I remembered to share about that too. Let's see. We're going to jump quick. When do we need to get counselors involved? Again, this is a question we're usually asking as we walk with people.
Yeah, I think just anytime there's any sort of abuse or brokenness, I think that's a great place to start. Any sort of affair, anything like that, that's great to be able to walk alongside with someone to continue to get resources, but also to have a safe place to continue to talk through, work through that.
Yes.
Especially as a culture where we're claiming to make marriage a priority. We
often will connect with counselors too if there's a prolonged addictive behavior as well. That's a place where we need extra resources to help, because there often is underlying things underneath an addiction, and so just helping us to get what are some of the roots of these addictive behaviors, and kind of identifying those patterns. Are there other key resources or ways that you would encourage people as they're praying with others who are needing healing in this area?
Yeah, I think so. Fight the New Drug has many resources on the resources page.
Is that specific to pornography, or is it sexual addiction in general?
So they have a thing called the Fortify program, which is specifically, it targets pornography, but also it allows you to interact with tracking your own sexual behavior.
Okay.
So there's that. It also provides an awesome opportunity for like a pamphlet for how do you, as a parent, initiate the conversation with children about their sexual identity. I think that's really important.
Great. Have there things that you've done with even with students, Sally, as you think about?
I think for students, we've really tried to just open conversation and so allow them to ask questions. A year ago, we did this with a series. We talked about sex in the midst of a series called Honor, and we allowed students to ask any questions. So it's interesting how often, the topic of masturbation came up, the topic of, is it okay to have sex, or pornography, what does that look like? There's just so many questions. And I think the thing that we have realized as staff as a married couple who does ministry in a similar setting, is that if we as the church are not defining things or helping or talking, then the world is going to. And so when they come with these questions, don't get me wrong, I totally have jaw drop moments where I'm like, just keep your mouth shut. Just keep your mouth shut. But at least they're talking to you about it.
Right.
And so if you don't have the answer, then counseling is such a great resource. Have them talk to a counselor. Have them talk to a pastor, someone that may know a little more. And if they don't know, that's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think it's better to be honest with it than to make up something.
Right.
But also in the midst of that, as an adult, like, know what your triggers are. And so if looking at Fight the New Drug, one of the great things that they do is they will say, hey, if you struggle with some kind of sex addiction, pornography, this will be a trigger article for you.
Okay.
So, and there's other places that do that too, that are just really wise and not wanting to bring people in, because we've also often heard of people that are really well-intentioned but then get dragged in by trying to help. And so,
I think that's really wise, actually. Yeah, just to think about your own triggers and boundaries and things like that. Great. Well, again, this is massive topic, but some other ways that we'll minister with people. And again, keeping shame out of the midst of it. You know, when we're having conversations with students or adults who are working through feelings of same-sex attraction and things like that, we'll see, you know, we're just loving well, we're listening well, we're asking God to affirm identity. We believe that God can clean up our imagination too. So we do something called a cleansing of the imagination prayer, where we're really asking the Holy Spirit to come in any images that we've taken in, which we all have. You cannot come into our culture and not have images. And we're asking Jesus to sort of clean that up. And I used to love doing that with students. They would see the coolest things, you know, it'd almost be sometimes like a movie reel, and Jesus would just come and pull those things all up and take them to the cross or pull them into his body. So that is great. There's often inner healing work, like we said, soul tie work, confession and repentance. Again, just identity, sense of being work, praying through shame. And there's some really great, again, there's lots of resources connected to these topics. Ransomed Heart Ministries has some great prayers that take you through praying through sexual wholeness. So a lot of really great resources that are available. There's not really a one-size-fits-all for this ministry, because every situation is a little bit different. But it's such an important topic to talk about. So, any closing words from our time today?
I'm excited the church is talking about this, you know, and so that as someone who works with youth, but also just a human being, I'm just excited that the church is talking about this. And to not be afraid, I think sex has been such a taboo topic for so long. So even as a prayer minister, when it is said, you can do what I do. Just ask the Lord to keep your jaw shut and listen. Because the truth is, the Lord will reveal his heart in the midst of it. And his heart is to heal. And so,
Amen.
And I think in respect to that, I'm very traditional oftentimes. So I just love the imagery of what it means to create a culture of honor. And so how do we continue to build healthy boundaries within relationships, but also within healthy boundary building outside of marriage or outside of a sexual relationship? When you enter into a marriage, continuing to build the healthy boundaries in relationship as well.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, Steph.